Hello, everyone. Today we'll start talking more carefully about Thomas Aquinas, one of the great philosophers, one of the great theologians in the medieval period. So let us continue. At the heart of Aquinas' conception of reality, basic answers to deep philosophical questions about what reality is like, is God. Aquinas thinks that God exists. In fact, that all of reality is ultimately explainable only by appealing to God, in much the same way in which, or in a similar way in which Plato thinks that reality, empirical reality, is intelligible by appealing to the forms that are the essences that ground the intelligibility of empirical reality. Something much like that is going on with Aquinas. So to get a basic sense of Aquinas' conception of reality and methodology for understanding reality, looking at his conception of God and how we know things about God is a great entry point onto Aquinas' way of thinking. So early on in the Summa, he asks about God. He engages with the ontological argument. He dismisses the ontological argument as a good way of going about knowing about God. And then he asks more broadly whether it is possible to demonstrate or prove that God exists. And some people have said no, so he engages with the question. And here's what he says. Demonstrations or proofs can be made in two different ways. One is through the cause, which he calls a priori, and the other one is through the effect, which he calls a posteriori. And these senses of a priori and a posteriori are slightly different, but they still overlap with what we've discussed in the past. A priori is that which is prior. And the way Aquinas thinks it, to provide a demonstration of something a priori is to provide kind of a conception of the cause in such a way that one grasps the essence of the cause and what sees and what's intellect how the effect follows from the cause. So something like Newtonian mechanics would be a good example of this, of course, subsequent developments in history. But a, say, contemporary computer model of a physical system that has a full description of a state of the system, location of particles and things like that, and the laws, the Newtonian mechanics, the laws that govern the motion of those particles. If you were to grasp all of that or put them into a computer model, you would just see how the system developed. You'll just see the effects that follow. You don't actually have to look at the world and like measure anything. If you just have the full grasp, the full understanding of those causes, you just see how the effect follows. So to prove an effect, Aquinas thinks, one can do it that way. One can fully grasp the nature of the cause and then just see that the effect will come about. And that is an effective proof of the effect. The a posteriori is through the effect. You look at the world, you look at effects, and then you reason your way back to the thing that caused it. So you look at the consequences and then investigate through scientific inquiry into what must be the case, what must be the thing that caused or brought it about to be that way. And here's what he says about God. The existence of God can only be demonstrated from his effects. We cannot do a demonstration of God's existence through the cause, to his own nature, God's own nature, because we're just not smart enough to grasp the essence of God and see how his existence follows from his essence. We can do that. God can do that about himself, but we're not smart enough to do that. We're finite intellect. Our intellect is finite. We're finite beings. So that's just beyond our capacities. However, we can look at the effects of actions God has taken, namely creating the world, and see that God must be there. In other words, Aquinas thinks we look at the deliverance of the senses, the five senses, sight, hearing, and so on, our connection to the physical world. And on the basis of what the senses give us about the physical world, we can deduce, work our way backwards, do some good science and conclude that God is the cause of the physical world. And that's exactly what the arguments for God are going to look like. And Aquinas thinks, because of our finite intellects, because of the kinds of beings that we are, that is the only way for us to come to know that God exists, by looking at the effects, looking at the physical world, and deducing, concluding that God was the cause, is the cause of the existence of the physical world. Here's one objection that Aquinas looks at in his discussion that I want to highlight. And here's what the objection to Aquinas' view says. It seems that the existence of God cannot be demonstrated, for it is an article of faith. and it is thus not demonstrable. Some people think of faith, like Christian faith, as the kind of thing that is separate from, it's other than reason, science, or investigation, philosophy. The reason, science, investigation, philosophy is what we humans do with our limited human capacities. The faith side is something else. It's some response to God that is just not grounded in reason. It's just a different kind of thing. And some people have said that. And Aquinas is going to disagree with that. Aquinas is going to say that faith and reason are intertwined in different ways. So here's his reply to the objection. The objection, again, is that we shouldn't even be thinking about proving the existence of God, because that's just something we take on faith, like everything on faith. We believers, right? Of course, if you're not a believer, you don't. But engaging, thinking about God, using your reason is just not the kind of thing that we should be doing at all. So here's what Aquinas says in reply to that objection. The existence of God and other similar truths about God, some things about God, which can be known through natural reason are not articles of faith proper, but are preambles to the articles. So that's hard to figure out exactly what he's saying if you're not familiar with his terminology. But what he's saying is that there are some things that are part of the faith, things that are part of Christian belief, that can be known by reason alone, that don't have to be taken on the basis of faith. They do not go beyond the limits of human reason. And an example that sometimes Aquinas uses as an example of an article of faith that goes beyond human reason, that must be taken on faith, is the Trinity, conception of God as in some sense three, and in some sense one. Aquinas thinks that we have some idea of what that means, but ultimately we must take it on faith. It just goes beyond a reason, a capacity to reason to understand what that means. Things like the God exists, Aquinas thinks, those are a different category of articles of faith. They're not faith proper. That is, they can be taken on faith, but we can also reason our way to them. They can be the legitimate conclusions of pure human investigation with no faith whatsoever. So we can know them on the basis of reason or take them on the basis of faith. And he calls the preambles to faith, the kind of the initial stage before we take the ascent of faith, or people take the ascent of faith in a reasonable manner. And crucial for our purposes, the existence of God is one of those things. So what that means for us is that Aquinas thinks that we can reason about God, that we can reason about whether or not God exists, and that the application of human reason to that question is not a misapplication. It is not trying to go beyond its capacities. It is whether or not God exists is something we can think about, reason about, and come to reasonable conclusions. So, okay, fair enough. Let's grant that to Aquinas. We can, in fact, ask questions about the faith, about one of the items of the faith, whether God exists. And we can, in fact, use a reason to try to answer it. So let's do that. Let's actually use a reason to try to figure out whether or not we have reasons for thinking that God exists, or reasons for thinking that God does not exist. And Aquinas gives us the most prominent reason for thinking that God does not exist, and I'll put it up shortly. And before we do that, though, it's crucial to know that that's a high bar. It's very hard to prove that something does not exist. It's much easier to prove that something does exist. So if I want to know whether there is, a fish in my fish tank, I go look for it, right? If I want to know that there are cows in my backyard, I get out and go and look in my backyard. So typically, the kinds of investigations about whether or not something exists, we think of the possible idea, the thing, the entity in question, and then we look to try to find it where it might be, and we'd look for evidence for its existence. So coming across evidence for the existence of something is not super easy, but easier than proving that something does not exist. And here's an example. So one time, some years back, I was having a discussion with a friend, and he was adamant that dragons existed, that they were part of the history, that they were real. And I was very skeptical. I kept saying, of course not, like there are no dragons. Those are mythical creatures. And he started putting forth several pieces of reasoning that were actually not bad. What he was giving me were not bad pieces of reasoning. And I realized my predicament. I could engage with him, piecemeal. Like every time he put forward some, piece of purported evidence, I can try to undermine it. And he But I realized that even if I were to do that successfully, even if you were to grant me 5 potential pieces of evidence and I were to successfully refute them all, I wouldn't have thereby shown my thesis, right? My thesis was there are no dragons. And even if I managed to successfully refute all evidence that there are dragons, that does not show that there are no dragons. At best, it shows that there is no evidence of dragons, but that's compatible with there being dragons. Um, right? So I realized my predicament. Proving that there are no dragons is extremely difficult. Providing evidence for the non-existence of something is very hard to do. So actually, I put forth a proposal that my friend did not take very lightly. The proposal was, if he were to show that there were dragons, he would bring me a platter with the head of a dragon. If he could, put forth a platter with the head of the dragon, I would, assent. I would agree. He was right. There are dragons. But I can put forth a platter with no head of a dragon, an empty, and then I would show that there were no dragons, right? But my friend was very thrilled with that. Because it doesn't prove anything, right? An empty platter does not show that there are no dragons. It's hard to prove that there are no dragons. For any claim, there's this thing that doesn't exist. It's hard to prove it. So anyway, the same thing applies about God. How do we prove that God does not exist? That's a very high bar. That's very hard to do. And yet this objection, this reason purports to do that. And it's been labeled the problem of evil. And it is the heart of the idea is that the existence of evil is evidence, perhaps sufficient evidence, that God does not exist. God is taken to be omnipotent. He can do anything. Omniscient. He knows everything. In all good, he's an all good being. And yet there is evil. That's very puzzling. That's very strange. So here's another story. Think of myself, I'm a father, I have a 5-year-old. If you were to see my 5-year-old with a big scratch on his forehead, he bled a little bit, there's some pain there. Let's call that evil. Pain is evil. Let's just go with that for now. And someone were to ask, oh, does that child have a father? Is it compatible with the existence of that child suffering pain, that there is a father? There are all sorts of ways of showing the compatibility, right? For example, it could be that I was not aware that he fell, he hurt himself. I was working in my office someplace else. So I just did not know what was going on when he hurt himself. And of course I exist, I just did not know that he was falling, so I couldn't prevent it from happening. So if someone were to point out, well, of course, there's a father. He didn't prevent it because he didn't know that he was falling and the accident happened. So my lack of knowledge about the existence of the suffering makes it compatible that I exist with the existence of the suffering of my 5-year-old. However, God is not like that. Purportedly, God knows everything. So we cannot say, oh, there is the evil, but God doesn't prevent it because he doesn't know about it. Of course he knows. He's God. He knows everything. So that way of making compatible my existence as a father with the pain and suffering of my 5-year-old is just not available. Here's a different way of making compatible my existence with the pain of my 5-year-old. Suppose I was aware. I was sitting in a bench. I took him to the park and he was playing. I was sitting in the bench in the shade watching him run around. And then he tripped and I saw him trip. And as he was falling, I got up and ran in his direction, but I was far away. I just did not have enough, speed, power to get there to stop him. By the time I got there, he was already on the floor. He was bleeding. The suffering was ended. So someone can point to that. Well, the father does exist. He did know that he was falling. He did, witness the tragedy, the event, but he was too far away. He didn't have the power to prevent it. He is not omnipotent. He's fallible. He has limitations. He exists. He knows what's going on, but he just couldn't stop it. He does not have the power to stop it. Again, that makes the story perfectly intelligible. The child is there, the father is there, the father knows, but it's not powerful enough to prevent the calamity. Again, that story is not applicable in the case of God either. God is omnipotent. He can do anything. If God wants something done, he just wills it and it happens. So it's not that God does not know of evil, and it's not that God cannot prevent evil, at least it seems. Here's the third, more kind of worse kind of explanation for, kind of more disturbing kind of explanation for what could be happening. I took my child to the playground and he was falling, and I was within arm's reach. I could have stopped it. So I knew what was happening. I knew of the pain, and I had the power to prevent it, but I didn't care. I'm a bad parent. I don't care about the pain falling on my children. That's one possible explanation. So that makes it compatible that I exist as a parent and my child has, pain and suffering. I know of it. I could stop it, but I'm not a good parent. I don't care. I let the pain befall upon my children. Uh, Again, that story, disturbing as it may be, is not available for God either. God is good, right? That's built into the very conception of God, that he's a good God. So it's not that God doesn't care about the evil. So the typical explanations are not available. God knows, he has the power, and he wants to, or he cares, so he's good enough, so he should care or should want to. And yet there's evil. That's very puzzling. And many people have taken that line of reasoning to be a very strong, perhaps sufficient reason for thinking that there is no God. Here's how Aquinas puts it. Aquinas puts it a slightly different way, but it's the same idea. Here's the basic argument put forth by Aquinas. Premise number one: if one of two contraries be infinite, the other would be destroyed. He has very simplistic terms. He's thinking more like water and fire. Water and fire, like fire evaporates water, and water, stops fire. So they cannot get to, they're opposites, they're contraries. They kind of destroy each other in different ways. If one were infinite, if it were to like occupy all of space, as it were, then the other one wouldn't be there because it would be kind of ruled out. And that's the kind of thought that Aquinas has behind this premise. Premise number two: God is infinite goodness. God is good. And evil and good are contraries. When there is good, evil is pushed away, is ruled out. When there is evil, good is pushed away, is ruled out. And if God is infinitely good, you see where this is going. There shouldn't be any space left for evil. Evil would just be ruled out by God's infinite goodness. So this is the first conclusion. Therefore, if God existed as an infinite good being, there would be no evil. That seems to just follow by this way of thinking. And yet, there is evil. We see it around every day, unfortunately. So what should be concluded? Well, that God doesn't exist. If God did exist, and we can reasonably think he would get rid of evil, but yet the evil is there, then we can conclude reasonably that God does not exist. This is the most powerful argument put forth against believing reasonably in the existence of God. And Aquinas sees that. This is a very old argument. People have been putting it forth for a long time, precisely because it's a very powerful argument. Here's Aquinas' reply. Aquinas is still a theist. Aquinas thinks that despite this persuasive argument, it is reasonable to believe in God. And here's the heart of his answer. God and evil are compatible because God allows evil only if more goodness comes out of it. So it's not that God knows, God can prevent it, and God in some sense wants to prevent it. But he doesn't actually prevent the evil because he thinks, Aquinas argues, some other good is connected with that evil that is greater than the evil. And therefore, in some sense, it outweighs it. The world is better. Humanity is better. For there being the evil because it is connected with this other greater good that God allows in it, because out of that evil, more good comes out of it, is produced by it. And if that's true, then God and evil are compatible. But okay, let's end here. We'll continue talking about Aquinas later. Bye.